In the summer of 2006, a small French publisher received an unexpected visit from government inspectors. They were not investigating fraud. They were not searching for drugs. They came for a book about nettles. The author, Bernard Bertrand, had committed a strange offense. He explained how to make a traditional plant preparation farmers had used for centuries. The recipe was simple: water, stinging nettles, fermentation. That was enough to trigger legal action. Under a new French agricultural law, publicly recommending or promoting an unapproved plant protection product could lead to criminal penalties, including massive fines and prison time. A fermented nettle mixture your great-grandparents could make in a wooden bucket had suddenly become legally dangerous. 50/50. And that raises an uncomfortable question. How does a traditional plant remedy become more restricted than synthetic chemicals manufactured in industrial laboratories? The answer begins with regulation. On paper, the rules were written for consumer protection. Governments argued that every pesticide, natural or synthetic, should pass safety testing before entering the market. That sounds reasonable, but the approval process came with a hidden requirement: money, huge amounts of it. Registering a plant protection product in Europe required toxicology studies, environmental impact assessments, residue analysis, and years of paperwork. The total cost could climb into hundreds of thousands, sometimes millions, of euros. For a multinational chemical corporation selling a patented molecule, that cost was manageable. For small organic farmers selling fermented nettle extract at local markets, it was impossible. And that is where the system quietly changed. The issue was not always that natural pesticides were explicitly banned. The issue was that only products backed by patent-level profits could afford legal approval. A corporation with exclusive ownership rights over a synthetic chemical could spend millions on registration because it expected decades of protected income in return. But nobody can patent a wild nettle growing beside a road. Anyone can grow it. Anyone can make it. Anyone can copy the recipe. There is no monopoly to recover the regulatory costs from. So traditional preparations slowly disappeared from the commercial market, not necessarily because they failed, but because the economics no longer worked. France became one of the clearest examples of this pattern. Public outrage erupted after the nettle case. Gardeners protested outside ministry buildings. Farmers argued that ancestral agricultural knowledge was being criminalized. And after more than a decade of pressure, the European Union eventually approved nettle extract as a recognized basic substance for agriculture. But it took 11 years. 11 years for regulators to officially accept a recipe farmers had used since the 18th century. And France was not the only case. Deep in the Amazon basin grows a tropical shrub called Rhyenia. For generations, indigenous communities used its powdered wood as a natural insecticide. In the mid-20th century, American researchers isolated its active compound and commercialized it for agriculture. At its peak, farmers used enormous quantities of Rhyenia-based insecticides against crop pests. It worked well. In some cases, it even controlled insects that had developed resistance to newer synthetic chemicals. But Rhyenia had one fatal weakness: it could not be patented. Over time, chemical manufacturers shifted toward newer synthetic insecticides with stronger intellectual property protections. As regulatory costs increased, companies stopped paying to maintain Rhyenia registrations. Not because the plant stopped working, because the business model stopped working. The same pattern appeared again with neem. The neem tree had been used across the Indian subcontinent for centuries as a natural pesticide and fungicide. Its agricultural uses were deeply rooted in traditional knowledge. Then in the 1990s, a major patent was granted in Europe covering a neem-based extraction method. Critics argued that corporations were attempting to privatize knowledge Indian farmers had practiced for generations. Environmental activist Vandana Shiva and other groups challenged the patent, arguing that the knowledge was not new at all. After years of legal battles, the patent was revoked. It became one of the most famous cases of what activists called biopiracy, the attempt to claim ownership over traditional biological knowledge through intellectual property law. And the larger question remained: how many similar cases were never challenged? How many traditional agricultural practices disappeared simply because no one had the resources to defend them legally? The story repeats itself again with pyrethrum. Pyrethrum comes from a daisy-like flower cultivated for its insecticidal properties for more than a century. The natural compound worked well and broke down quickly in sunlight, making it relatively environmentally friendly. But scientists later modified the molecule to create synthetic pyrethroids, chemicals that lasted longer and could be patented. Investment flowed toward the synthetic versions. The natural version remained technically legal, but gradually lost market share because the regulatory and economic system rewarded the products capable of generating protected profits. Again, the issue was not always direct prohibition. It was structural advantage. The same economic pressures shaped the fate of rotenone, a plant-derived pesticide used historically in parts of Asia and South America. Rotenone carried legitimate safety concerns, and later research connected exposure to neurological risks. But when regulators demanded expensive new studies, manufacturers simply abandoned registration rather than paying millions to defend an old, unpatented compound. And that detail matters, because it reveals how modern agricultural regulation often operates. Products do not survive simply because they are effective. They survive because somebody can afford the approval process. In 2009, the European Union introduced stricter pesticide approval frameworks requiring extensive toxicological and environmental data for nearly all active substances. The scientific requirements were enormous. For large corporations, these were normal business expenses. For farmer cooperatives, traditional remedies, and small biopesticide producers, they became barriers almost impossible to cross. Eventually, regulators created a special category for lower-risk, basic substances to simplify approval for certain natural materials. But progress remained slow. Only a small number of traditional plant preparations received approval over more than a decade. Meanwhile, hundreds of synthetic chemicals continued moving through the standard regulatory pipeline. This is the central mechanism most people never see. The chemical industry did not necessarily need to ban natural pesticides outright. It only needed a regulatory system expensive enough that unpatented solutions could not compete. A patented synthetic molecule can absorb massive regulatory costs because exclusive ownership guarantees future profits. A homemade plant decoction cannot. So one survives commercially. The other quietly disappears from shelves. The system was shaped around applicants with large budgets, and the applicants with large budgets were usually selling synthetic chemicals. That does not automatically make every regulation corrupt or every synthetic pesticide dangerous. But it does explain why so many traditional agricultural tools faded from public use even when they remained effective. Our ancestors relied on nettles, neem, horsetail, pyrethrum, and countless other plant-based preparations long before industrial chemistry existed. Those recipes were passed through generations by farmers, herbalists, and agricultural communities. The plants still exist. The knowledge still exists. The nettles still grow beside roads and fences. What changed was the economic structure surrounding agriculture. Traditional remedies became difficult to commercialize inside a system designed around patents, registration fees, and industrial-scale approval costs. But there is one thing regulation cannot fully eliminate: knowledge itself. A government can regulate products sold in markets. It cannot erase the memory of how people once farmed. And once knowledge survives outside the marketplace, it belongs to everyone again.